in conversation with Anna North. A little bit about the book. It's described as a rich, magical new novel on belonging and identity, love and trauma, nature and renewal. And it's described as one of Elif Shafak's best works yet. So our author, Elif Shafak, is an award-winning British-Turkish novelist. She writes in both Turkish and English and has published 19 books, 12 of which are novels. Her work has been translated into 55 languages. Her latest novel, prior to this, 10 minutes, 38 seconds in this strange world, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize and the RSL Undante Prize and was chosen as Blackwell's Book of the Year. Her previous novel, The 40 Rules of Love, was chosen by BBC among 100 novels that shaped our world. Shafak is an inspiring public speaker and twice TED Global Speaker. She contributes to major publications around the world and was awarded the Medal of the Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et Lettres. And Anna North is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and the author of 3 novels, Outlawed, a New York Times bestseller, America Pacifica, and The Life and Death of Sophie Stark, which received a Lambda Literary Award in 2016. She has been a writer and editor at Jezebel, BuzzFeed, Salon, and the New York Times, and she is now a senior reporter at Vox. She grew up in Los Angeles and lives in Brooklyn. Tonight, we will be using our Q&A feature, so if you have questions for our authors or conversation points, you are welcome to use that. We'll be posting a link to purchase the book in our chat feature. Anna, we're ready to hear from you.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. I'm so excited to talk about this wonderful novel. Elif, do you want to start off by reading just a tiny bit for us, just to give folks who haven't read the book yet a little bit of an idea of what they're in for?
Thank you so much, Anna. It's so nice to share this platform with you. You know, I'm very excited about this conversation. I don't like long readings, so maybe just a very short, brief reading from the very beginning, perhaps. And may I start by saying this book is dedicated to immigrants and exiles everywhere, the uprooted, the rerouted, the rootless, and to the trees we left behind, rooted in our memories. And this is how it begins. Once upon a memory, at the far end of the Mediterranean Sea, there lay an island so beautiful and blue that the many travelers, pilgrims, crusaders, and merchants who fell in love with it either wanted never to leave or tried to tow it with hemp ropes all the way back to their own countries. Legends, perhaps, but legends are there to tell us what history has forgotten. It has been many years since I fled that place on board a plane, inside a suitcase made of soft black leather, never to return. I have since adopted another land, England, where I have grown and thrived, but not a single day passes that I do not yearn to be back, home, motherland. It must still be there where I left it, rising and sinking with the waves that break and foam upon its rugged coastline. At the crossroads of 3 continents, Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Levant, that vast and impenetrable region vanished entirely from the maps of today. A map is a 2-dimensional representation with arbitrary symbols that decide who is to be our enemy and who is to be our friend, who deserves our love and who deserves our hatred and who our sheer indifference. Cartography is another name for stories told by winners. For stories told by those who have lost, there isn't one.
Thank you so much. I think you can already tell from that just at the level of the sentence, this book is really stunning. And I want to remind everybody also, I know folks were mentioning this in the chat, but if you have questions for the author at the end of my questions, we'll take some. So please put them in the Q&A function. And we'll choose some later on. But my first question for you is just, there's so much going on here in this book and we can talk about all the themes more, but what was what was sort of the germ of the idea for you? How did this book begin?
I think with every book, I don't know if you'd agree, there are multiple beginnings, not necessarily just a single starting point. But the thing is, I've been wanting to write about Cyprus for a very long time. I feel emotionally attached to the island. I love this place. And there's no doubt in my mind that this is a beautiful island with beautiful people, north and south. But at the same time, it's a very difficult story to tell. As you know, as we're speaking, there's a partition line that cuts across the island, which is guarded by UN troops. And it literally divides, it separates Christians from Muslims and Greek Cypriots from Turkish Cypriots. So the past in Cyprus, in my opinion, is not a bygone affair. It's something that's very much alive and breathing within this present moment. In other words, the wounds are unhealed, they're still open, and there are clashing memories, there are clashing narratives. So how do you tell the story of a place that has experienced this kind of division and ethnic violence and hatred, without yourself as a storyteller falling into the trap of nationalism or tribalism? I could not find an angle. I could not find a window or a door into the story for a very long time. I've been thinking about it, researching, talking to people, reading. Only when I found the voice of the fig tree, only then it gave me a completely different perspective and maybe a bit more courage to approach the story. So it might sound odd, but I feel very grateful to the fig tree.
I wanted to ask you about that next, because when I've been talking about this book to people, I've been saying like part of it is narrated by a fig tree, and it actually works. So, tell me how you found that voice. I think, there are so many pitfalls in trying to narrate from, it's not an inanimate object, right? Of course, we know, we hear in the book again and again that obviously this is a form of life with sort of an intellect all its own. But talk to me about how you chose the fig tree and then how you developed a voice for something that doesn't speak in the way that we speak.
Yes, there are so many pitfalls, of course, and I think it's a risk for a writer. I'm aware of that risk in the sense that if it doesn't work, if that voice doesn't work, the whole thing collapses almost. So, but to me, it felt very organic. It felt very natural. Once I started hearing the voice of the tree, it really felt completely natural that that this be the leading voice in the story. So I didn't want to put too much worry into it and just follow this intuition, almost like an animal instinct. And I think there is room for intuition when we write novels. Of course, there's a lot of, thinking, reading that goes into it. But in my opinion, when you write a novel, at least for me, the experiences, I like to be guided by intuition. So I did follow that irrational sense, perhaps. And also thinking about the tree, of course, gave me a chance to explore more closely issues that are very close to my heart. What does it mean to be rooted or uprooted, almost deracinated, rerouted or rootless? So those metaphors were very important for me. And if I may add this very quickly, I lived in the States for a few years. And when I was in Michigan, Ann Arbor, as a visiting scholar, I remember the winters were very cold. And some people, some Italian immigrant families, Italian-American families, they would bury their fig trees if the winters were particularly chilly. And I remember that. And come next spring, they would unbury the tree. So it's a fascinating botanical technique. This vertical tree becomes horizontal, buried under the ground for weeks or months, and then you unbury. And of course, that theme of burial and unburial of secrets and untold stories is particularly important in the case of Cyprus.
I was shocked that you could really do that with a tree. It's so fascinating. It's a really fascinating part of the book. We don't have to obviously give like a full plot summary here, but can you tell folks a little bit about how this particular fig tree sort of intersects with the lives of the human families in the book?
Yeah, well, this is a female tree, so she travels actually from Nicosia to London, from Cyprus to the UK, from one island to another island. It's an immigrant tree in that regard. And of course, one of the many, many remarkable things about trees is if you take a cutting with you, and if you plant that cutting, if the weather permits, allows this, there's a good chance that it will grow and thrive and become both a new tree, but genetically also a continuation of the old tree. And again, that metaphor was important for me to explore, you know, again, what does it mean to be an immigrant or to be displaced or to be an exile? I care about these issues a lot. So the tree, I think, also gave me perhaps a longer perspective, because trees live longer than us. They were here before us, and one day we humans, we will disappear and trees will still be around. I think we have so much to learn from them. From human perspective, we tend to believe that time is linear, that tomorrow will have to be more progressive or somehow better developed than yesterday. But from a tree's perspective, time is cyclical. You know, there are patterns. There are circles within circles. I think tree time is closer to story time. And from a tree's perspective, actually, you can also see that sometimes humans do not learn, and generations can make the same mistakes that their great grandparents had already made. So I like that longer perspective, and also this feeling of being an ecosystem, which is something we easily forget. We tend to think we're the center of the universe as humans. We think we're superior to other creatures. But in fact, we are a tiny part of an entire ecosystem.
Yeah, I love that. And so the fig tree is a big voice in the book, but there's other characters that we follow. We follow Kostas and Defne and sort of their love story. And then we also follow Ada, you know, the sort of, in some ways, she has some parallels with the fig tree. She's also, you know, the descendant in certain ways. I mean, it's all the relationships between the humans and the tree get complicated. But talk to me a little bit about how you created her character. I find it often so hard to create young people, teenagers. She's so funny, she's so strong, but she's also really grieving the loss of her mother. Talk to me about how did you create that person?
Yeah, I mean, she's, you know, she's strong, she's intelligent, she's asking lots of difficult questions. At the same time, she's anxious, worried, grieving, of course, confused. And the reason why I mention all of these is because I think it is a difficult age to be young. You know, I think young people, particularly the age we're living in, it's a time of anxiety, angst, almost like an existential angst. We have entered the age of pessimism. There's lots of uncertainties. And especially for younger people, I think it's much, much harder. I honestly think sometimes it's almost like there's a scream building up inside so many people. And so many people, East and West, feel voiceless, which is, again, one of the biggest paradoxes or ironies of our times, because we were all supposed to have more voice thanks to digital technologies, the proliferation of social media. But where we are right now is so many people feel either voiceless or as if like their voices are not being heard at all. So that to me is important. And the second thing is Ada, she comes from mixed parents, and she's living in a world which never celebrates multiplicity. I think, like Walt Whitman used to say, we all contain multitudes as human beings. The problem is we're living in a world that never allows us to be multiple, let alone celebrating our own multiplicity. That too, you know, increases the sense of confinement, especially for children coming from immigrant backgrounds, because you have so many belongings that you want to talk about and you're not allowed to. So lots of things pile up, and I think that scream keeps building up. I want to add one more thing very quickly. I am very interested in intergenerational memories. You know, of course, as writers, we love to write about family stories, but I think we're equally drawn to family silences. So the things that we cannot talk about, but are still nonetheless transferred from one generation to the next. So Ada is very much aware of the silences in the family.
Yeah, I want to talk more about intergenerational memory, but I wanted to ask about the scream. You know, this is a really powerful early scene in the book. Ada has lost her mother, and she's in school, and all of a sudden she screams, and we don't exactly learn why, and the scream ends up having these repercussions, perhaps without spoiling too much, having these repercussions that she couldn't imagine. So talk about, what are the things that you wanted to convey in that scene, and tell me about the ways that it sort of reveals how Ada is both isolated and then also connected to all these people that she never realized she might be connected to.
I think we need to talk about inherited pain, and it's not an easy subject to talk about, but I find it so important. And again, trees can help us to understand inherited pain. Especially in the last 2 decades, there has been a remarkable body of literature about trees and how sentient they are, far more than we recognize. And many studies show that trees that have experienced some kind of trauma, like wildfires or drought, they respond differently to the next trauma. In a way, they carry the memory of what they have experienced. Not only that, but trees that descend from ancestor trees that have experienced trauma also respond differently. So I find that fascinating. But when it comes to us human beings, we're more ready to talk about how we inherit the color of our hair or the shape of our cheeks or our chin from our ancestors, our grandparents, for instance. But we're not that ready to talk about, do we also inherit other things like sorrow or melancholy, or the pain that they might have gone through? Something trickles down, something shapes us, continues to shape us. So I think Ada in that regard is very much shaped by all those gaps in the story and the silences and the traumas. But to be honest, I think we're living in an age in which many things are screaming. The nature itself, like in Edvard Munch's painting, it's the world around us that's screaming. There were wildfires this summer in Greece and in Turkey. And I don't know if you've seen these videos, but it was incredibly moving. The sounds of animals and trees burning. So there's lots of things that are screaming in our planet right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. And to sort of go off that, I had read other interviews with you where you talked about this issue, this idea of inherited pain. It's such an interesting thing to talk about. Talk a little bit more about this idea, and then particularly about how that sort of pain and displacement can show up in the second and the third generations, right? So we meet Ada, she's born in England, she's growing up in England. And as you mentioned, there are sort of silences and things that aren't told to her. So what is she inheriting? What is she learning to kind of cope with about her inheritance?
Yes, I mean, she's of course born and bred in the UK, and her parents, they don't want to talk about the past too much because they want life to be a, tabula rasa, new beginning for her. They don't want to burden her with their own memories, with their own experiences. And I understand that, but that doesn't mean she doesn't feel them. What I've experienced or observed actually personally on both sides of the Atlantic, especially among immigrant families or any family that comes from a complicated background, it's very interesting. The first generation, the ones who have experienced the biggest hardships, obstacles, the elderly, they don't have a language to talk about these things. So they carry those memories all inside. They're there, but they don't talk about them. And then the second generation, especially if there has been a displacement or they have to adopt, they find their feet in a new place, new land, they're not that interested in the past, understandably. They have to be forward-looking, they have to build a new life. So it's the third or the fourth generations in these families, the youngest in these families, who are actually asking the biggest questions, the sharpest questions about identity, their ancestors' journeys, and they are keen to discover. They're eager to learn. So I have met young people carrying old memories because they're the ones who are now carrying the memories of their grandparents. And that to me is very striking.
Yeah. I think this would be a good time also to talk about place. I'm curious where you were in the world when you wrote this novel, and whether, did you write it in London, and what was it like to try to conjure Cyprus when presumably, at least for much of the work on this novel, you weren't able to be there?
Yes, I mean, of course, there's a big diaspora here in the UK. There's a big Cypriot community, both Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. And I think writers need to be two things, our whole lives. You know, we have to be good readers, but also good listeners. I love listening to people. I love listening to not only what they're telling me, but also how they're saying what they're saying, with what kind of energy, the choice of words. So that to me was important, just listening, trying to understand, you know. There's a lot of research behind this book, of course. I started writing before the pandemic, but parts of it were finished during the pandemic. And I think, like many people, I felt the need or the urgency to reconnect with nature, with trees. You know, this is something that I've been feeling for a long time, but the pandemic accelerated that feeling. So all of that also shaped, I think, the story and the direction of the story, and this feeling of an ecosystem. I love, you know, Cyprus, but the Cyprus that I wanted to travel does not only exist today. I'm also traveling to Cyprus of 1970s, 50s, 60s. So there's a lot of imagination in addition to research.
Yeah. And to talk more about research for a minute, I loved all the sort of botanical and biological detail in the novel. It's such a richness. What kinds of scientific research did you have to do to write this?
Yeah, I'm just a curious person, you know, who loves reading since my childhood. It's simple, but I think it's very fundamental. And what I like is to have eclectic reading lists. So sometimes when some readers, it's usually male readers who do this, you know, at book festivals, book events, they come and they say, so much is happening in today's world. Everything is so fast, changing so fast, and I want to understand the world. So I read philosophy, I read technology, finance, politics, history too, but I don't have time for fiction. My wife reads fiction. You know, my girlfriend reads fiction. And when I hear this, I really feel sad, because I think inside fiction, there is history, there is politics, there is technology, there is neuroscience, there is psychology, philosophy, and perhaps much more importantly, there's emotional intelligence. And I don't know a single person in this life who doesn't need emotional intelligence. But perhaps more importantly, I think we should read across the board. So fiction and nonfiction, rather than compartmentalizing knowledge and locking knowledge into little boxes. What I am interested in is these interdisciplinary conversations. I find it much more interesting when a fiction writer becomes interested in neuroscience, or when a neuroscientist loves poetry, or when a poet loves film theory, or a film director is interested in political philosophy. Those are the conversations that I think challenge us more intellectually. So I'm a big believer in eclectic reading lists.
Makes sense. And then just thinking, thinking about some of the sort of overarching themes that run through the novel. I mean, one thing I kept noticing, and I found this refreshing and almost weirdly comforting at, this particular time in the world. This is a novel that looks really unflinchingly at death, but also one in which death isn't always necessarily the end, or not always the final end. Talk a little bit about the relationship between death and rebirth in this book.
There's, as you know, there's a bi-communal organization in Cyprus, which is launched by the United Nations, but it's the Cypriots, it's the islanders who are doing the groundwork, the real work. And Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots are working together on this committee. It's called the Committee on Missing Persons. And many of them are volunteers, so many of them are young people, and many of them are women. They come from all walks of life, all professions. Among them, there are scholars, academics, but also forensic specialists, people working in the lab. There are students, teachers, and basically what they're doing is they're digging the ground in order to find the bones of people who have gone missing during the troubles, during the time of ethnic violence and conflict. And the reason they're doing this is not because they want to revive old animosities or hatreds, just the opposite. They want to give the dead dignity, in a way, a proper burial, and the families a sense of closure, a possibility for healing. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because it's so important, not only in Cyprus, but in South America, in Argentina, in Bolivia, in Chile, in Spain after the Civil War, in Bosnia after the genocide, and of course in Iraq more recently. There are people in this world who are digging the ground to find the bones, because they do know that if we cannot remember, we cannot repair. And what we cannot repair, we're bound to repeat. So if we want to build a better world and learn coexistence and peace, memory is a responsibility. So in that regard, death is not a clear-cut end. How we give dignity to the dead, how we heal the wounds, whether we can grieve together, whether we can talk about the past in a calm, nuanced way, all of that matters. I think memory matters.
Yeah, that makes sense. And sort of going off that then, I wanted to talk too about sort of, this book's life in the world, and the world in which, we're really debating a lot of the issues that come up so frequently in the book. So I know you're also a political scientist, and this is a novel that's so deeply engaged with reality, even though it's fiction. It's engaged with climate change, it's engaged with ethnic violence, with homophobia, with colonialism. I know this is in some ways a question that gets asked a lot, but talk to me about how you see the role of fiction in dealing with those issues, engaging with them, as opposed to nonfiction or journalism.
Yeah, I so appreciate the question. For me, fiction is where my heart beats. It's always where everything seeps into everything, every subject that we're talking about, or every little, thing that I read, it all comes back to fiction. However, I'm also aware of the fact that if you happen to be a storyteller from a wounded democracy, like Turkey, like Brazil, like Venezuela, and that list is so long actually, and it's getting longer and longer. If you happen to be a storyteller from such backgrounds, you do not have the luxury of being apolitical. You can't say, I don't want to talk about what's happening outside the window. I only want to talk about my fiction. You can't say that when so much is happening outside the window. Also, I am a feminist. I've learned many wonderful things from past generations of feminist movement, including that politics is not only about what Boris Johnson said today or what happened in the parliament yesterday. Wherever there's power imbalance, inequality, there is politics. So the personal is also political. So you might be writing about sexuality or gender, that too is political. Now, defined in this way, I don't think novelists in particular, because the canvas of a novel is so vast, and it's a platform full of ideas and pluralism. A novelist cannot be apolitical. That said, for me, there's a distinction. I am not interested, in trying to give any answers. I don't know the answers myself either. What I'm interested in is questions. I want to be able to ask questions, including difficult questions, including about silences and taboos, and create an open space where a diversity of opinions can be heard, but always leave the answer to the reader, because every reader is going to come up with their own answers, and I have to respect that. So it's not the kind of fiction that preaches or tries to teach anything. I don't know the answers myself, So we're discovering, we're learning together. But I love asking questions. I love the kind of fiction that dares to ask questions.
That's great. And speaking of questions, I should say again that if you have questions for Elif, you can drop them in the Q&A and we'll have time at the end. But I have a couple more questions for you. I wanted to talk about climate change specifically. I mean, hearing you talk about the wildfires, I'm thinking about also wildfires in California, where I'm from. And sometimes as a fiction writer, it feels like what am I even ever doing sitting at my desk? Why am I doing anything other than addressing this? Talk a little, like, how do you think about climate change as a writer? Because it is something that does come up in the book. It's really intimately connected with the topic of this book. How do you confront this issue that seems so much larger than all of us?
Yeah, I think we are at a major crossroads, and the decisions that we're taking right now, they're going to impact the next decades and generations' lives. It is a crucial moment of emergency, urgency, and things cannot go on like this. There's some radical restructuring we have to initiate in our lives, in our communities. We need to care about inequalities, because for me, climate environmental crisis is very much connected with inequalities. If you care about environmental destruction, it means you also care about racial inequality, gender inequality, class inequality, but also regional inequality, digital inequality. They're all interconnected. And that's the world we're living in, when we need to realize we are all interconnected. So it really breaks my heart that at a moment when we need global solidarity and global sisterhood more than ever before, where we have ended up is vaccine nationalism. Where we have ended up is more tribalism and isolationism. It is an illusion to think that by erecting walls or closing our doors, we're going to keep other people's problems at bay. There's no such thing. So I think it's a moment in which we're going to need more conversations across borders. And I also, I think about emotions a lot. In many ways, this is an age of, as I said, anger or anxiety, understandably so. But the thing is, what do we do with our anger? That's the crucial question. I don't mind that we feel, angry or anxious or worried from time to time. Maybe if we don't, it means we're not following what's going on in the world. When we do follow, of course, it affects us. And we're all struggling with lots of negative emotions, including mental health issues. We need to have open, inclusive conversations about mental health. So all I'm trying to say is all these negative emotions that are maybe sometimes like burden on our shoulders are actually a raw source of energy. So the main question is, can we turn it into something more constructive, positive for ourselves and for our communities? I just want to add that there's only one emotion that really scares me and worries me, and that is the lack of all emotions. So it's numbness, it's apathy. It's an age of angst, but it will be much worse if it turns into an age of apathy. So coming back to climate crisis, if we start saying climate emergency is so big, I'm so small as an individual, what can I do? Nothing. Or what's happening in Afghanistan is heartbreaking, but what can I do? Nothing. And the moment you start piling up these questions and believing that we can't do anything as individuals, is the moment we enter into the age of apathy. And I think that will be a much more difficult and dangerous and harder world to live in.
Yeah, that makes sense. Going back to something that you said earlier, talk to me a little bit about how the pandemic has impacted your writing. How much of this book did you write during the pandemic? And, what did you find the effects to be of everything that we've been through in the last 20 months?
I think it affects all of us, doesn't it? And I remember at the beginning of the lockdown here in England, some publishers with good intentions tweeting, saying that the lockdown was not going to be a huge difference for authors because particularly novelists are solitary creatures. We don't do office work. We're used to working from home. So it's not going to affect writers or novelists as much, they were saying. And I was surprised when I read that because my experience hasn't been that way at all. And I think you question yourself when so much is happening, when people are dying in their thousands, and when there's so much uncertainty, you question, does it really matter whether I find the perfect synonym, whether I find, whether I move this comma from here to the next sentence? And that kind of questioning actually is a healthy thing. There's a beautiful essay by Doris Lessing in which she says, literature is analysis after the event. Things happen, then you need to allow some time to pass so that writers can digest and process. In that regard, all writing is in retrospect. I understand that, I respect that, but I think in this age, literature also has to become analysis during the event, not only after the event. So how we respond through our words, if you're a painter, through your paintings, if you're a poet, through your words, is important. In my opinion, we all need to become more engaged and involved citizens.
That makes sense. That's great. I think we have time for just a couple more questions, and then we'll go to your questions. So put them in the Q&A if there are things you want to ask. One other thing that I wanted to ask you, Elif, is something that we talk about a lot in my writing group is how difficult it is to write a good going viral scene. So to write a scene where something that you do goes viral on the internet. And there is a scene like that in your book, and it comes off wonderfully. And I think it's this fascinating thing where you're able to span really such a large such a large span of time in the book and such a large span of emotional registers. So everything from, again, we see ethnic violence in Cyprus, and we see decades pass. And then in the UK, this young woman has something she does go viral on the internet. So talk a little bit about capturing those different time periods, and then also just about capturing social media, which I think is really hard still for novelists to do. It's hard for me to do.
Yeah, it's hard for me as well. I fully, I hear you in that regard, and it's very tricky, isn't it? I think the social media is a bit like the moon. It does have a bright side, of course. It does connect us, and I'm not underestimating that, especially in countries where patriarchy is so. I think patriarchy is universal, but it's sharper in some countries where the public space, doesn't allow an equal room for women. I do not underestimate the fact that within digital space, many women try to carve a space for themselves. Also in countries where there's no proper freedom of speech, many people connect through social media. All of that is important to me. But I think because we haven't spoken about the darker side of social media for a very long time, and we had this extreme optimism in early 2000s, this techno-optimism, about digital technologies, we urgently need to talk about the dangers of social media, how it reduces our world into tribes, into echo chambers. I believe we're living in a world in which we have way too much information, but very little knowledge and even less wisdom. And they're completely different things, information, knowledge, and wisdom. We over-romanticize information, but the truth is we can't process this much information. It doesn't stay with us. And it's very fast. It's based on fast consumption. Whereas knowledge is something we can't rush. Knowledge requires to slow down. You need books for knowledge. You need in-depth journalism and nuanced conversations. And for wisdom, hopefully, I think we need emotional intelligence. We need empathy. We need to bring the mind and the heart together. So I want to change that ratio. Less information. Let's have less information in our daily lives, but more books, more knowledge, and hopefully, ultimately, more wisdom. And I think when I approach social media, I try to focus on things that I really love, whether it's women's rights, things that I really care about, LGBTQ+ rights, freedom of speech. I share messages on literature, art, culture. Try to use it in a more positive way, but I'm very much aware that we need to be very careful about the monopolization, that's going on. So I'm worried about social media, to be honest.
As am I, all the time. I just have, this has been so great. I have 2 more questions for you, and then I'm going to turn it over to reader questions, because I see that there are a few. So one thing I wanted to ask is, at the end of the book, we're still really at the beginning of Ada's life in a lot of ways. She's still very young. She has a lot of life ahead of her. She has a lot of processing ahead of her of the sort of memories that she's unearthed. I'm curious if you are a writer who thinks about what would happen to their characters after the book is over, and how do you think about that with respect to Ada, who's so young?
That's such a beautiful question. I usually don't. I mean, when a story is over, I do not try to bring it with me, or like a sequel, I do not do that. But in this case, I've been wondering what would Ada be like, when she's older. So maybe one day I might come back to the story, but not at the moment.
And you anticipated my next question, which is what's next for you? What are you working on now?
When I finish a novel, I don't immediately start a new one. I think there's a pendulum for me. I like to do I become a more normal human being, a more social human being. I like to do book events, literary events. There's a part of me that believes book festivals and these conversations that we're having, I think these are among our last remaining democratic spaces where we can come from completely different backgrounds, listen to each other, have nuanced conversations, slow down a little bit. So I really appreciate festivals, book gatherings, book events, library events. I do more of that. I read, and then when the pendulum swings back, that's the time when I start writing the next one.
I love that. That's a good image. I'll keep that with me. I want to turn to some of these reader questions. This one is from someone who says they're a big fan of you. I'm Turkish and I have all your books, mostly in Turkish and some in English. This person also says, do you ever think about putting your beautiful novels into movies? And they've thought about this for several of your books, including 38 Minutes and several others.
I really appreciate that. I would love that to happen, of course. I think many novelists would. And it's also important for me because I tend to think visually. So many scenes come to me as pictures first, like one of my earlier novels, The Bastard of Istanbul. It was just thinking about this woman walking in the rain in Istanbul with a broken heel in a city where she experiences sexual harassment, people looking at her and she's furious. It was almost like a scene, like a picture. Sometimes that's how it begins for me. So I would love to see them, being adopted. But of course, it's a difficult relationship between cinema and literature. But when it works well, it works wonders. So I'd be interested in that.
That's great. I would love to see this one as a movie. Reminder, we probably have room for more if folks want to add, but I love this question. I've had very important individual trees in my life. Can you share any stories of specific trees that have been important to you?
That's amazing. I don't go back to Istanbul anymore, and I miss the city a lot. And I think I carry the city with me, and I think it's very visible in my writing. So there are moments when I noticed that I wish I could have taken a tree with me from Istanbul. I wish I could have done the same thing. I wish I could have planted a tree. I'm a tree hugger, I love spending time next to trees. And as I get older in life, I think I appreciate them more and more.
Here in Prospect Park in Brooklyn, they put signs up everywhere saying it's okay to hug this tree, which I thought was very sweet. This one is good too. Do you ever write, this person says, quote unquote, on location to try and capture place, environment, nature? When you visit a place, are you jotting down notes to try to decide, what you're going to write about later?
I do take notes. I listen to people a lot, but a lot of this is sensual in this, so it's mostly flavors, smells, sounds. I think memory is so interesting. What we remember through emotions and senses. And I try not to forget that. So food is plays an important part in my writing. There's an auntie in this book, Aunt Mariam. I think I almost feel like I know her because I was raised by women like her. My grandmother was like her. My grandmother's house was full of superstitions and lots of food. And I think for them, food is a language. So these are women who have experienced lots of things in life, lots of hardships. They have so much to tell you, but they don't know how to tell you. So instead they feed you. And they almost have this naive belief that if we could only sit around the same table and break bread together, maybe there would be less animosity in this world. So I'm interested in these things as well. I love and I respect written culture. I've in a way dedicated my life to books, but I try not to lose sight of oral culture, oral storytelling, this other world that doesn't necessarily make it into books. And there's a part of me that would like to bridge as much as I can written culture and oral culture.
That's great. And we have another question. Who are other authors that write about taboos that inspire you?
Well, that's a beautiful question. In its heart, I think at its heart, literature is about resistance, isn't it? There's a rebellion at its heart because literature can rehumanize people who have been dehumanized, and we want to pay, at least I feel this way, more attention to the periphery rather than the center, to silences more than all this noise that's going on in the dominant narrative. So there's a part of me that wants to give more voice to voiceless, or make the invisible a bit more visible, just change the power hierarchy, turn it upside down. And I think there's so many writers and poets who are doing exactly that in their own way, each of us in our own way. But I believe that's what literature does.
That's great. And we talked about this a tiny bit, but I think this question gets at it from a different way. How did you go about writing a teenage character? Did you talk to anyone or do any research to kind of get into a different generational mindset?
I did talk to many people. I have lots of teenagers actually around my daily life as well. But again, it comes back to listening. And I believe many young people are actually carrying lots of anxieties inside. When I look back, I earlier mentioned my grandmother. Okay, these people have gone through lots of difficulties, but they always retain this belief that somehow tomorrow would be better. And if you could give a better education to your kids than the education you had as a parent, they would have better job opportunities, a better future. But now in today's world, we have lost that faith. This is a time when people no longer believe, whether you have good education at a time when the job market is changing so fast. We don't know in 50 years, in 30 years, which jobs are going to be still around, which jobs are going to disappear, what's going to be the future of AI, what's going to be the future with climate emergency and so on. So lots and lots of uncertainties with so many anxieties. When I listen to young people, I try to also hear not only what they're telling me, but the worries and the angst that maybe they're not expressing easily, but they're carrying within. I try to listen to that as well.
That's great. That's great advice. Another reader asks, how does being multilingual affect your writing? Do you ever find yourself wanting to use a word that doesn't have a direct translation in English? Or do you think in one language and write in another?
I so appreciate this question because language for me is such a big passion. And I never see language as an instrument. It's not like a fork and knife or a tool that you use and set aside. I see it as a space you enter in. And I think languages shape us. Of course, as you can hear in my mispronunciation, the mistakes that I make, I am not a native speaker. This, for me, English for me is an acquired language. And I started learning English in Spain, actually. I was 10 years old at the time. So Spanish was my second language, and then English became my third. But the thing about English is it never abandoned me. It kept coming with me, and I loved it. I would write little, maybe poems, stories, but always keep them to myself. My earlier novels were all written in Turkish first. But about 15, 16 years ago now, I switched. And I started writing in English first. And that was such an irrational thing to do. Had I put more thought into it, I would be so intimidated, so scared. But again, it was like an animal instinct because I needed some sense of freedom, another zone. Being a writer in Turkey is a very heavy thing. It's heavy. Being a women novelist in Turkey is even heavier. Anything you say, anything you write might offend people, whether it's political, sexual, and somehow writing in English gave me another space of existence, and I needed that sense of freedom. In an interesting way, it also brought me closer, or it also maybe helped me to take a closer look at my own motherland, like having a cognitive distance. If you want to see a painting more closely, you don't get closer, you take a step back. So it was a bit like that cognitive distance. But overall, what I can tell you is what I like is the commute between languages. So that sense of freedom is something that I appreciate a lot. However, if my writing has melancholy or sorrow or longing, I still find these things much easier to express in Turkish. But when it comes to humor, which I adore, I think humor is our oxygen. So humor, irony, and satire are much, much easier in English.
Love that. And I love the idea of taking a step back from your language. That's so fascinating. I think we have time for a couple more questions. And this one is really fun and interesting. So we were just talking about superstitions, and a lot of your characters are very superstitious. Are you superstitious?
That's a brilliant question. Of course, I'm going to say no. And then as soon as I turn this off, maybe, I'm going to do something really superstitious. Still, I mean, my grandmother's teachings, like you should never take scissors or a knife from another person. You have to spit on their hand first. Or, these small things in daily life. I catch myself doing these things. There's a part of me, I don't know if I'm superstitious, but I do take superstition seriously. And I know at some point in the book, it says they are the projection of our deepest fears. They come from somewhere. So I try to pay attention to what those fears are.
I think that's right. I think they are about our deepest fears. I was reading my son a book, and it has a story in it about superstitions, and I found myself so anxious I could barely read it to him. I was like, I want to skip this story, even though I don't, I'm not avoiding all these things anymore, but it really stuck with me. This has been so wonderful. I'm going to ask, I think, one or two more questions. There have been so many good ones here. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out. And I know the Politics and Prose folks have been dropping the link to buy this wonderful book in the chat, so please use that. One person asked, you talked a tiny bit about this, but has there been anything new for you in the pandemic in terms of hobbies or pursuits? I mean, I know this is complicated because not every, we haven't all had time to do new hobbies, but what, if anything, has surprised you about how you've used your time?
I'm trying to learn how to make sourdough bread, and I'm not good at it. But I think it's amazing. It's so calming, and there's something so precious about that experience. You nurture it in a way. You work on it. You put effort into it. But that's the thing about the pandemic, isn't it? Because it made us realize very sharply. It made us realize that what really matters are actually those immaterial things in life. Family, friends, love, sisterhood, just the luxury of sitting under a tree and reading a book. So again, it comes back to the same thing. We are at a crossroads, and we need to rethink, what are my values? What do I want? Is it more money? Is it more greed? Is it this constant rush, haste that never ends? Or is it actually something more immaterial that can't be measured in terms of money, but is actually precious? Those are the things that we have to bring to the fore. So like many people, I found myself connecting with trees, doing seemingly small things, but appreciating them more. And just friends and family and sisterhood, I would say. I would always add those.
That's great. And we've gotten a couple of questions about your reading. So I think I'm going to close with those. One person asks, is there an author that really moves you? Another person asks, have you read anything this year that you highly recommend? Just talk about what you're reading right now. What has your reading life been like? I know it's hard to find time to read right now.
I do read. I mean, I try to read or try to make reading continuous, and books move me, not only one single author. It's difficult for me to pick just one author, but as I mentioned earlier, what I try to do is I usually read one fiction and one nonfiction at the same time. So I keep two books by my bed, and I also read lots of poetry. I like, poems from the Middle East, the Levant, sometimes mystical poets. I try to read them alongside political philosophy or cultural history, things that don't normally come together. That's what excites me. But just to keep reading, and maybe if there's a silver lining, we've been talking about the pandemic, it is that more and more people have been reading more books. And that's a good thing. Especially in an age in which we consume everything so fast, maybe we're realizing that our need for novels, for stories, for books is very universal, and it's not going to hopefully disappear anytime soon.
That makes sense. And I'm going to cheat because we have a couple minutes left. I'm going to read one more question because it's a good one. This reader says that they're very excited to read this book after listening to this conversation, and that they actually ordered it after seeing it on the Reese's book club list. And they want to know, what did that kind of acknowledgement mean to you as a writer?
It was amazing. I mean, I'm very happy. I was thrilled, actually. The thing is, when you're inside a novel for such a long time, weeks and months and over a year, you don't quite know what it's going to mean anything to anyone. You have a faith, and you keep going, but you have no way of knowing. So once the book is out, and then you realize it might have touched someone's heart, someone living in maybe miles away, continents away, that is very precious. That's very beautiful. In Turkey, where I come from, one of the things that makes me so happy is people bring me their books, and then you realize, because different people have read the same copy, underlining different sentences by using different colored pens, that's very precious. So a book is not a personal item. If we love it, we talk about it, we share it. And that's why I find book clubs so important. That kind of word of mouth, sharing the same story, talking about the same story. I honestly think if books are alive today, we owe that to people who are sharing and spreading the love of books. So it really means a lot to me.
I love that our books are not personal items and they're meant for sharing. I absolutely agree. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. Thank you so much to Politics and Prose for hosting us. Once again, the link to buy the book is there in the chat. And just so much recommend this book. I think it gives such a broad and beautiful depiction of not just humanity, but many other plants and animals. So thank you so much for being here. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you, Anna, for moderating this excellent discussion, and Elif for writing the book and for talking to us about it. Again, the book is available in store and online. We have the link available in our chat and on our website, and we hope to see you all again soon in person some point. Take care.